Most of us were taught that the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 was a stunning triumph of military modernization. We are told it was a story of a small, rising Asian nation, defeating the largest, most fearsome empire on Earth. History textbooks focus heavily on the steel dreadnoughts, the brilliant naval tactics of Admiral Togo, and the shocking destruction of the Russian fleet. But this familiar version of history leaves out a fundamental law of modern warfare. You cannot fire artillery shells if you do not have the credit to buy them. Before a single ship was sunk in the Pacific, a much quieter and far more decisive war had already been fought. It was not fought with torpedoes or rifles, but with sovereign bonds, gold reserves, and private telegrams. If you look past the battlefield and open the ledger books of the early 20th century, a completely different narrative emerges. The Russian Empire was not just defeated by the Japanese military, it was systematically starved of capital, heavily outspent, and financially suffocated by a single private investment bank on Wall Street. This is the hidden chapter of 1904, a time when global power was shifting away from kings and emperors and moving into the hands of those who controlled the flow of war debt. To understand how an ancient empire was brought to its knees, we have to look at the massive imbalance of power at the turn of the century. In 1904, the Russian Empire spanned 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. Tsar Nicholas II commanded an endless supply of manpower, a massive agricultural economy, and a seemingly invincible aura of imperial authority. Japan, on the other hand, had only been open to the world for a few decades. It was a small island nation, severely lacking in natural resources, and constantly anxious about Russian expansion into Manchuria and Korea. On a purely military map, the impending conflict looked like a suicide mission for Tokyo. But wars are not fought on maps alone, they are fought on balance sheets. And on paper, Japan had a terrifying existential problem. The Japanese government had soldiers, it had courage, and it had a modernized navy built in British shipyards. But it did not have the cash to sustain a prolonged, industrial conflict. The imperial treasury in Tokyo held barely enough gold reserves to keep the military functioning for a few short months. Once that gold was gone, the war machine would simply stop. They needed to buy millions of tons of coal, ammunition, and medical supplies from the West. To do that, Japan needed hard currency, which meant they needed to borrow a staggering amount of money from foreign investors. They needed a lifeline of international credit. In the winter of 1904, a man named Takahashi Korekiyo, the deputy governor of the Bank of Japan, packed his bags. He was sent on a desperate, quiet, diplomatic mission to the financial capitals of the world. His job was to convince Western bankers to buy Japanese war bonds. If he failed, his country would be crushed under the weight of the Russian army. Takahashi arrived in London, the absolute center of global imperial finance at the time. He walked into the grand, dimly lit offices of the city's most powerful financial institutions, carrying ledgers that proved Japan's economic discipline. But the doors of the banking world slammed shut in his face. European bankers were cold, calculating, and heavily invested in the status quo. Nobody in London or Paris wanted to lend money to an Asian country that was almost mathematically guaranteed to lose. Furthermore, Paris was the primary creditor to the Russian Empire. The French banks had already poured billions of francs into Russian railways and Russian state bonds. They were not going to finance a war against their own biggest client. For weeks, Takahashi sat in his London hotel room, staring at empty agreements, watching his nation's time and money run out. Japan was effectively cut off from the global credit empire. Without an immediate injection of cash, the war was already lost before the major battles even began. But history often hinges on unexpected encounters, in rooms where the public is never invited. In April 1904, Takahashi attended a private dinner party in London, hosted by a British banker. He was seated next to an American, a man who had been quietly listening to the Japanese diplomat's desperate situation. This American was not a politician. He commanded no armies, and he held no elected office. His name was Jacob Schiff. Schiff was the senior partner of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, one of the most powerful investment banks on Wall Street, rivaling even J.P. Morgan. For Jacob Schiff, banking was not always a neutral calculation of risk and reward. Sometimes, a loan agreement could be used as a geopolitical weapon. Schiff had a deep, burning personal hatred for the regime of Tsar Nicholas II. For years, the Russian state had actively sponsored and encouraged brutal pogroms against its Jewish population. Just a year earlier, in 1903, the horrific Kishinev pogrom had shocked the world, leaving dozens dead and thousands homeless, as Russian police stood by and watched. Schiff, a prominent Jewish-American philanthropist, had tried petitioning governments, funding refugee programs, and writing angry diplomatic letters. But he soon realized that the Tsar did not care about moral outrage or newspaper headlines. The Tsar only cared about power. So, Jacob Schiff decided to speak to the Russian Empire in the only language it could not ignore, the language of credit, liquidity, and sovereign debt. When Schiff looked across the table at Takahashi, he did not just see a desperate Japanese official. He saw an opportunity to fund a proxy war against the government he despised. The next morning, the financial architecture of the Russo-Japanese War completely shifted. Schiff agreed to underwrite an initial massive bond issue for the Japanese government, starting with $10 million, a fortune at the time. But he did not stop there. Schiff used his immense reputation and his deep connections in New York, London, and Germany to build a powerful financial syndicate. He convinced other major banking houses to buy into the Japanese war debt. Over the next year, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, along with its syndicate, floated a series of loans that injected roughly $200 million into the Japanese war effort. To put that into perspective, this sum covered nearly half of Japan's total war expenditures. It was the oxygen that kept the Japanese military breathing. With Wall Street money flowing into Tokyo, Japan could suddenly afford to keep its ships fueled, its soldiers fed, and its artillery firing. But Schiff's strategy was a two-edged sword. While he was pumping limitless liquidity into Japan, he was actively working to strangle Russia's financial supply lines. Schiff enforced a strict boycott among his network of international financiers, forbidding them from participating in any Russian state loans. He leaned on banking partners across Europe and America, isolating the Tsar's financial agents. The Russian Empire, heavily reliant on foreign capital to maintain its vast, inefficient military bureaucracy, suddenly found its credit lines drying up. When the Russian government tried to issue new bonds to pay for the escalating costs of the war, the markets were remarkably cold. The Tsar had millions of men in uniform, but he was rapidly running out of the cash needed to move them across the Siberian Railway. The war was no longer just a clash of empires in Manchuria. It had become a vicious, invisible banking deal, a test of who could survive a targeted financial collapse. Let us pause for a moment and look at the physical reality of this financial leverage. Imagine the Baltic Fleet of the Russian Navy, setting sail in October 1904. It was a massive, terrifying armada ordered to sail halfway around the world, from northern Europe all the way to the Pacific, to relieve the besieged Russian forces at Port Arthur. The journey took 7 agonizing months. The fleet required constant resupply, burning thousands of tons of coal every single day. But because Russia's credit rating was tanking, and because diplomatic pressure was mounting, they struggled to buy coal at neutral ports. The Russian sailors were exhausted, the ships were overloaded, and the logistics were a nightmare of delayed payments and denied contracts. Meanwhile, the Japanese fleet, fully modernized and comfortably financed by American and British capital, waited in the Tsushima Strait. In May 1905, the two fleets finally met. It was not a battle, it was an execution. In a matter of hours, the proud Russian Baltic Fleet was sent to the bottom of the ocean. Most historians highlight the superior speed and gunnery of the Japanese ships, but behind the smoke and the sinking steel was the cold reality of a ledger book. The Japanese guns were firing shells bought with New York capital, while the Russian ships were fighting under the weight of an empire going bankrupt. The consequences of this financial attack did not stop at the shoreline. When a nation loses its ability to borrow money, the burden always falls immediately and brutally on its poorest citizens. By 1905, the Russian economy was imploding. The Tsar, desperate to pay off his massive war debt, squeezed the working class and the peasantry with unbearable taxes. Food shortages swept across the cities, inflation wiped out savings, and the factories became breeding grounds for anger. In January 1905, thousands of starving, desperate Russian workers marched on the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, asking the Tsar for bread and relief. The Tsar's guards opened fire, massacring unarmed civilians in what became known as Bloody Sunday. This sparked the Revolution of 1905, a violent uprising that cracked the very foundations of the Romanov dynasty and paved the way for the total collapse of the empire 12 years later. The Russian soldiers who died in the trenches of Manchuria and the workers who bled on the snow in St. Petersburg did not know about the private dinner party in London. They did not know about Jacob Schiff or the $200 million in Japanese war bonds. They were simply the collateral, the physical bodies forced to absorb the shockwave of a financial crisis they did not create. In September 1905, the war officially ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth, signed not in Asia, but in the United States, under the watchful eye of President Theodore Roosevelt. Russia was humiliated, forced to cede territory, and forced to recognize Japan as a dominant power. Japan emerged victorious, celebrated across the globe as the first modern Asian nation to defeat a European empire. But Japan also learned a terrifying, silent lesson about the nature of 20th century sovereignty. They had won the war, but they had mortgaged their entire future to Western banks. It would take the Japanese people decades of heavy taxation to pay back the principal and interest on the bonds that Schiff had arranged. They had traded the threat of Russian military occupation for the invisible chains of Wall Street debt. A nation may fly its own flag and parade its own army, but if its treasury is owned by foreign creditors, its independence is always conditional. This is the hidden ledger of 1904, a history where power is not measured by the size of an army, but by the ability to keep a credit line open. We are taught to view wars as moral struggles or strategic clashes between heads of state, but when you strip away the propaganda, the patriotic speeches, and the military uniforms, you are often left with a very cold, very mechanical financial transaction. The Russian Empire was defeated because a small group of men in a dimly lit banking hall decided that it was time to close the Tsar's account. History remembers the admirals and the generals and the treaties signed in grand rooms. But the true cost of an empire is always calculated in the margins of a debt ledger, and the bill is always passed down to the people who were never invited to the table. What do you think? Was the Russian Empire truly destroyed by the military brilliance of Japan, or was it inevitably doomed the moment Wall Street decided to cut off its credit? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.